All right, we have come to the end of our founding fathers exploration. We've got the last two founding father eras presidents. We're also ending the Virginia dynasty today as we talk about James Monroe and James Madison, what I have titled a presidential bromance. These two guys were very good friends, had a little bit of a falling out, and then came back together during their course of their political careers. So let's check out a little about these two guys. James Madison is probably best known for being the author of the Constitution. He, in 1787, when the Constitutional Convention was convening in Philadelphia, showed up with what he called the Virginia Plan, which had the basic structure of government that we enjoy today. Three co-equal branches of government with a system of checks and balances. He showed up with that because he knew kind of whoever got that first plan on the table was going to be probably the most influential person in the discussion, and so he's given credit for doing that. James Madison lived at a place called Montpelier. Uh, it's in Virginia, right? He's part of that Virginia dynasty. It's outside Washington, D.C. as well. It is a cool place to go visit. I know I say that about all these places. I'm a history dork. I love going and seeing where people lived, how they lived. I think it tells you just a ton about who these guys were. If you look at that picture I've got for you, right above the door, there's a window. That was James Madison's study. And when you go in there, they've got his desk laid out. And just to kind of think that that's the desk, right, where he's writing what would become the Constitution of the United States, is just a cool thing to go and see. It is a plantation. He does own slaves his entire life. And still, like a lot of these founding fathers, had a very conflicted relationship with slavery and the idea of slaves. He didn't like it, but he profited from it at the same time. He thought it was wrong, but he didn't think that the government was strong enough to stop slavery at the same time. So really is in kind of a difficult spot there. Again, if you ever get a chance, though, Montpelier is a neat place to go and see. Um, he is also the father of our Bill of Rights. And so once the Constitution had been written, we talked about the Federalist Papers are going to argue for it. He's one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. One of the big complaints about the Constitution of the United States was that it did not have a Bill of Rights. He was kind of wishy-washy on the subject as whether it needed it, but when it looked like it needed it to pass, he sits down, actually wrote 12 amendments that would have been the Bill of Rights. Only 10 of them get adopted, but like I said, he was responsible for a lot of the writing there. He is also considered to be one of the fathers of the Democratic Republican Party. Even though he was a fan of the strong central government, he and Thomas Jefferson decided that perhaps it was getting too powerful, and so he and Jefferson will co-parent the Democratic Republican Party that will ultimately take power with Jefferson's election in 1800, and then maintain power through Madison's presidency as well. Um, the biggest thing about James Madison that you see quite a bit is just how little he was. He's probably the smallest man ever to be president. He was only 5 feet 4 inches tall. Supposedly weighed 100 pounds. So he is a small guy. He gets introduced to James Monroe by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had taken James Monroe under his wing and encouraged Madison to get to know him, to give him things to do because he saw a lot of promise in James Monroe. So that friendship and working relationship kind of starts with Thomas Jefferson. Aaron Burr, yes, that Aaron Burr, the guy that shot Alexander Hamilton, will introduce James Madison to his wife. Her name was Dolly Todd. So she becomes Dolly Madison when they're married. Dolly Madison is a great example of kind of what the First Lady was in the 19th century. in that she is very much, kind of the consummate hostess. Famous story about her is when in the War of 1812, the British burned the White House. That she cuts out a famous picture of George Washington and rolls it up and takes it with her. But she was kind of the same way Adams and his wife had a relationship where they really talked about things and respected each other intellectually. Dolly was kind of on that same level. She'll survive a lot longer than Madison will, and becomes kind of the first lady of Washington D.C. In her widowed years. And so there's some cool stories that are told about them. They never have children of their own. She had a child from a first marriage that Madison will adopt. He is kind of a punk. He was always running up gambling debts, and James Madison and Dolly were always trying to pay off his gambling debts and asking him to reform and get better. And so he was not an easy part of the relationship. Biggest thing that happens in Madison's presidency is the War of 1812. We're going to talk about the War of 1812 later on in the course when we focus in on wars, but it is a war with the British. Many people consider it to be the second American Revolution. Probably the two biggest things that are going to happen are the burning of Washington, D.C., and the Battle of New Orleans. The burning of Washington, D.C., in the aftermath, the British troops are going to Baltimore and try to take over that city and split the United States in two. They're turned back at Fort McHenry, and that victory is commemorated in our national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. The Battle of New Orleans was in New Orleans and will make Andrew Jackson famous. Even though it happens after the peace treaty had been signed, they didn't realize that. But the victory kind of allows the United States to feel like they won the War of 1812 and left with kind of a more positive feeling from that. Once Madison is done, he turns to his Secretary of State, James Monroe, and James Monroe will win his own term as two terms as President of the United States. He has a really interesting time. He's a Democratic Republican as well, and when he gets elected, the Federalist Party that had been with George Washington is going to go away. We'll see what that does. He was raised on a farm, kind of the same way that Madison was. His parents died when he was 11, 12 years old, and so he is orphaned and left in the care of an uncle who took care of him. He did have to drop out of school. He was the oldest child. I think when his father died, he was 16. And he was the oldest of the number of kids, so he dropped out to take care of his brothers and sisters. Eventually, he'll go to the college at William and Mary, and his studies there are what bring him to the attention of Thomas Jefferson. And so that'll be where he gets introduced to that guy, and then ultimately he'll get introduced to James Monroe. He served in the Revolutionary War. Have you ever seen that famous picture of Washington crossing the Delaware? One of the guys in Washington's boat in that portrait is James Monroe. He served on several different battlefields. He was an anti-federalist, and so didn't really like what was going on with the Constitution. That's going to be where he and Madison have a little bit of a split on some of these political ideas. But he ends up becoming part of Jefferson's administration and Madison's administration. So it doesn't necessarily hinder any kind of political future for him. This is the guy that negotiates the Louisiana Purchase, doubles the size of the United States in a deal he makes with France. And during the War of 1812, he has a unique position in American history, and he holds two cabinet positions at once. He is the Secretary of State, handling our foreign affairs, but he is also Secretary of War, what today we call the Secretary of Defense, at the same time. And that, of course, is not something that commonly happens, but it does show the trust that President Madison had in future President Monroe. The coolest thing about the Monroe administration is that it was what was known as the era of good feeling. And basically, what happened is this is as close as we get to kind of that ideal version of America that George Washington encouraged people to embrace when he told them to avoid the spirit of party. And James Madison, when he's elected, the Federalist Party, the party of George Washington, John Adams, collapses. It doesn't really have anything to do on a national scale anymore. So there's only one political party. And so for a lot of his presidency, there's just the Democratic Republicans. Eventually, they start to have disagreements about issues, and there'll be factions that form within that party. But just imagine today, how much calmer things would be if there was only one political party. Not that that's necessarily the ideal, because you don't have people challenging the other side's ideas and things like that. But it would be a different political environment. Two big things that are going to happen in James Monroe's presidency. One is he was trying to solve the problem of slavery, and he thought this isn't going to work if the slaves try to stay in the United States, and so he actually arranged for the founding of a country called Liberia in Africa. And the idea was that they were going to purchase slaves and send them to Liberia so they could have their own country. That happened. Liberia is still a country today, the capital of which is Monrovia. And so it didn't happen on any kind of wide-scale use. Of course, slavery won't be gone until the Civil War. But again, kind of an early solution, but kind of predicts the Back to Africa movement that'll be toyed with during the Civil War and then in the 19-teens and 1920s. The thing that bears Monroe's name that is his most important contribution is the Monroe Doctrine. While he's president of the United States, he issues a doctrine which is basically his thoughts on something, in which he says that the Americas are closed to colonization. There were other countries, Britain, Spain, Portugal, France, places like that were looking at folks or countries in Central and South America looking for places to set up colonies. He thought that was dangerous to the security of the United States, and so he basically puts it out and says, look, if anybody is going to be influential in the Americas, it'll be the United States. European powers, you need to stay out. And so that becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine, that the Americas were closed for colonization after the Monroe presidency. And so that one still sticks around today. That's one that you hear about and probably most closely associated with his name. But those are our first 5 presidents, and we've gotten to, like I said, the end of the Virginia dynasty and the end of guys with direct ties to the founding fathers and the Revolution being involved in the presidency.